Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The dusty streets are silent, save for the creaking of a swinging saloon door. Two figures stand face to face, hands twitching near their holsters. In an instant, a shot rings out. A duel settled, in seconds, leaving one man standing and the other crumpled in the dirt. This is the image Hollywood has burned into our minds about the Wild West, a land of gunfighters, outlaws, and lawless frontier towns. But how much of this is myth, and how much is history? The Wild West wasn't just a chaotic battleground of lawmen and outlaws. It was a transformative era in American history, filled with expansion, conflict, opportunity, and ultimately, a struggle between civilization and the untamed frontier. It was a time of legendary figures like Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and Sitting Bull. But it was also a time of harsh realities. Violent clashes between settlers and Native Americans, brutal outlaw gangs, and lawmen struggling to bring order to lawless boomtowns. But how did the Wild West come to be? And more importantly, what led to its fall? In this video, we'll explore the westward expansion that created the frontier, the rise of outlaws and the lawmen who hunted them, the devastating struggles faced by Native American tribes, the forces, technology, government policies, and economic shifts that brought the era of the Wild West to an end. By the time we're done, you'll see that the Wild West was far more complex than the legends suggest. So saddle up, because we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood periods. The birth of the Wild West, VT. Story of the Wild West didn't begin with gunslingers or outlaws. It began with opportunity. A vast, untamed land stretched beyond the Mississippi River, and for many Americans, it was a land of promise and adventure. But while settlers saw it as a new frontier to conquer, Native American tribes had called it home for thousands of years. What followed was an era of migration, conflict, and expansion that laid the foundation for what we now call the Wild West. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803, a vast frontier opens up in 1803, the United States made one of the most important land deals in history, the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the purchase of 828,000 square miles of land from France for just $15 million, around $342 million today. This single act doubled the size of the young nation and provided vast new lands for settlement. The Louisiana Purchase included present-day Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and parts of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. At the time, most Americans lived east of the Mississippi River, and the newly acquired land was largely unexplored. To map this mysterious territory, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an expedition, 1804-1806, where they documented the landscapes, Native American tribes, and wildlife of the region. This acquisition ignited the dream of westward expansion, a dream that would eventually fuel the movement known as Manifest Destiny. Westward expansion and manifest. Destiny, the push. Westward. With so much land now available, Americans were eager to move westward. The belief that the U.S. was destined to expand across the continent, Manifest Destiny, became a powerful national ideology. Many saw it as their God-given right to settle these new lands, bringing civilization, democracy, and economic opportunity with them. But why did so many risk everything to travel west? The lure of land. The Homestead Act, 1862, gave settlers 160 acres of free land if they agreed to farm it for 5 years. Land was seen as wealth and independence, and for poor families, it was a chance to build a new life. However, Native American tribes already inhabited much of this land, leading to tensions and violent conflicts. The gold rush and economic opportunity. The discovery of gold in California, 1848, Colorado, 1859, and South Dakota, 1874, drew hundreds of thousands to the west. Boomtowns sprang up overnight, leading to economic booms and lawless frontier towns. It wasn't just gold. Silver, copper, and other valuable minerals also attracted miners and entrepreneurs. The spirit of adventure. For many, the West symbolized freedom, adventure, and self-reliance. Trappers, explorers, and cowboys became iconic figures, helping to create the myth of the Wild West. Wagon trains and pioneer families braved dangerous journeys, crossing vast deserts, mountains, and rivers to reach new lands. The West represented limitless possibilities, but it also meant displacing the people who had lived there for centuries. The role of Native Americans, early conflicts and resistance. As settlers pushed west, Native American tribes found themselves caught in an escalating battle for survival. For thousands of years, indigenous nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Apache, and Navajo had lived off the land, hunting buffalo and maintaining deeply spiritual ties to nature. But westward expansion brought devastating consequences: broken treaties and displacement. The U.S. government signed numerous treaties with native tribes, promising to respect their lands. However, as more settlers arrived, these treaties were repeatedly broken or ignored. Native American land was either taken by force or through manipulative deals that left tribes with little choice. The Indian Removal Act, 1830, and the Trail of Tears. Under President Andrew Jackson, the U.S. government began forcibly relocating native tribes from their ancestral lands to reservations in the West. The Trail of Tears, 1838-1839, saw the Cherokee Nation and other tribes forced to march thousands of miles under brutal conditions. Thousands died along the way. Early clashes and native resistance. As settlers, ranchers, and miners invaded indigenous lands, Native American resistance grew. In Texas and the Great Plains, tribes like the Comanche and Kiowa fought to defend their territories from encroaching settlers. In the Southwest, the Apache, led by warriors like Geronimo, waged fierce resistance against both U.S. and Mexican forces. On the Great Plains, the Lakota Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud and Sitting Bull, successfully fought off U.S. military forces in a series of early conflicts. The fight for the frontier was only just beginning. The stage is set for the Wild West. By the mid-1800s, the West was no longer an unexplored wilderness. It was a battleground between settlers, soldiers, and Native Americans. Towns were springing up, railroads were being built, and new industries, ranching, mining, and farming were booming. But with opportunity came danger. The rise of lawless frontier towns, clashes with Native American tribes, and the desperate struggle for survival led to the birth of the Wild West as we know it, a land of outlaws, lawmen, cowboys, and chaos. But how did this era unfold? What role did infamous figures like Jesse James and Wyatt Earp play in shaping the West? And what forces eventually tamed the frontier? Stick around, because the real story of the Wild West is just getting started. The Golden Age of the Wild West. The Wild West wasn't just a time of lawlessness and adventure. It was an era of explosive growth, economic booms, and legendary figures. Between the 1840s and 1890s, gold rushes, cattle empires, outlaw gangs, and rapid railroad expansion reshaped the American frontier. This was the golden age of the Wild West, a time when fortunes were made overnight. Justice was often served at the barrel of a gun, and America's frontier spirit defined the nation. Gold rush and boomtowns, striking it rich, 1849 and beyond. The California Gold Rush of 1849 was the single most important event in the economic rise of the Wild West. It triggered a massive influx of fortune seekers, transformed small settlements into booming cities, and set the stage for the lawless, unpredictable nature of frontier life. The 1849 Gold Rush and its impact. In January 1848, James W. Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California. At first, the news was dismissed as a rumor, but when reports were confirmed, tens of thousands of people rushed west in search of gold. By 1849, over 300,000 prospectors, known as the 49ers, had arrived in California from the U.S., China, Europe, and Latin America. Towns like San Francisco exploded in size, becoming major hubs of trade, gambling, and crime. The rise of mining boomtowns gold wasn't just found in California. Major strikes in Colorado, 1859, Nevada, 1859, Montana, 1864, and South Dakota, 1874, led to the rise of mining boomtowns. These towns were often wild, violent, and filled with gamblers, saloons, and outlaws. Famous boomtowns included Deadwood, South Dakota, where Wild Bill Hickok was famously shot while playing poker; Virginia City, Nevada, home to the massive Comstock Lode, one of the richest silver strikes in history; Tombstone, Arizona, a lawless town where the famous gunfight at the OK Corral took place. While some prospectors became rich, most ended up broke, scammed, or dead. Eventually, large mining companies took over and individual prospectors were pushed out. But by then, the West had already changed forever. Cattle drives and cowboys, the rise of the cattle kingdom as the mining boom slowed, cattle became the new gold. The vast grasslands of Texas, Kansas, and Wyoming were perfect for raising cattle, and the demand for beef in the East led to the rise of cattle barons, cowboys, and long, grueling cattle drives. The birth of the cattle industry. After the Civil War, millions of wild cattle roamed Texas. Ranchers like Charles Goodnight and John Chisholm began rounding them up and selling them to Eastern markets. This led to the era of the Great Cattle Drives, 1866-1886. The Chisholm Trail and Cattle Town's cowboys herded cattle hundreds of miles north along trails like the Chisholm Trail and the Goodnight Loving Trail. Cattle towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita became boom towns filled with saloons, gambling halls, and outlaws. Cowboys earned only $25–40 per month, but they became folk heroes, representing independence, adventure, and toughness. The end of the cattle drive era. By the 1880s, barbed wire fencing, overgrazing, and the expansion of railroads made cattle drives obsolete. The era of the free-range cowboy ended, replaced by corporate cattle ranching. But the image of the cowboy, with his hat, boots, and six-shooter, would live on forever in Western legend. The Outlaws and Lawmen, the battle for the frontier, this eye. Wild West wasn't just about hard work. It was also about crime, gunfights, and legends. With weak law enforcement and easy money from mining towns, outlaws roamed freely, robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains. But where there were outlaws, there were also lawmen determined to bring justice. Famous outlaws of the Wild West: Jesse James, a former Confederate guerrilla who became America's most famous bank and train robber. He was eventually betrayed and shot in 1882 by one of his own gang members. Billy the Kid, a young gunslinger who was said to have killed 21 men before being shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, leaders of the Wild Bunch Gang, known for their daring bank and train robberies. They later fled to South America. Legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, famous for the gunfight at the OK Corral, 1881, where he and his brothers battled outlaws in Tombstone. Wild Bill Hickok, a former lawman and gunfighter, he was shot while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota, holding the now famous Dead Man's Hand, aces and eights. Bass Reeves. One of the first black U.S. Marshals, Reeves arrested over 3,000 outlaws and was said to have been an inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Justice in the Wild West was often brutal and swift, with outlaws hanged, shot, or run out of town. But as railroads expanded, bringing more settlers and government control, the law began to tame the frontier. Railroads and expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad changes everything. Perhaps the most transformative event in the Wild West was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Before this, traveling west was dangerous and slow, requiring months on wagon trains or perilous sea voyages around South America. But with the railroad, the West was now connected to the East, leading to mass migration. Thousands of settlers, ranchers, and businessmen could now travel west in days instead of months. Economic growth, goods, mail, and livestock could be shipped faster, fueling new industries. The decline of Native American power. With railroads cutting through their lands, Native American resistance was crushed. The railroad also marked the beginning of the end of the Wild West. Civilization was coming, and the untamed frontier was fading fast. The Wild West reaches its peak. By the 1880s, the Wild West was thriving. Boomtowns were growing, cowboys were riding the trails, and outlaws were making their last stand. But change was coming fast. The very things that built the West, gold, cattle, and railroads, would also be the things that tamed it. So how did the legendary Wild West finally come to an end? What forces civilized the frontier, and what happened to its most famous figures? Stick around, because the end of the Wild West is just as dramatic as its rise. The Wild West has been immortalized in movies, books, and TV shows as a land of endless adventure, lawless shootouts, and larger-than-life figures. But how much of what we see in Hollywood actually reflects reality? The truth is far more complex. While some towns did experience high crime rates, the idea that the entire West was a lawless, chaotic place filled with duels at high noon is largely a myth. Many frontier towns had sheriffs, local militias, and strict rules about carrying firearms within city limits. For example, Dodge City and Tombstone, two of the most famous Wild West towns, had strict gun control laws, requiring visitors to check in their weapons at the sheriff's office. The real violence often happened outside of towns, in unpatrolled areas where bandits, cattle rustlers, and hostile encounters with Native American tribes were more likely. One reason the West seemed so lawless was the lack of formal legal institutions in newly established settlements. Without an organized court system, justice was often handled by vigilantism. In some cases, vigilante groups helped bring order to lawless areas by hunting down criminals when local law enforcement was non-existent or too weak to act. However, these groups also abused their power, hanging people without trial and targeting certain racial or ethnic groups, especially Chinese, immigrants, and Native Americans. In places like Montana and California, vigilante committees were sometimes more feared than the outlaws themselves. One of the darkest realities of the Wild West was the treatment of Native Americans. While Hollywood often portrays them as obstacles to be overcome by brave pioneers, the real story is one of displacement, broken promises, and resistance against overwhelming odds. The U.S. government signed dozens of treaties with Native American tribes, promising them land in exchange for peace. But as more settlers poured westward, these agreements were repeatedly broken. The discovery of gold and the construction of railroads meant that native lands were constantly seized, and when tribes resisted, the U.S. military was sent to crush them. One of the most infamous examples was the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, where thousands of Cherokee, Creek, and other tribes were forcibly relocated to Oklahoma, resulting in the deaths of thousands. Later, conflicts like the Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, where General Custer and his men were defeated by the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne, were used as justification for even harsher military campaigns. The Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 marked the tragic final chapter of armed Native resistance, with U.S. soldiers killing over 250 Lakota men, women, and children. Forced assimilation followed. Native children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their culture. Tribes were pressured to abandon their traditions and adopt European ways of life. This period of history is often overlooked in popular media, but it was a defining part of the real Wild West experience. Ultimately, the Wild West wasn't just a place of adventure and lawlessness. It was a place of deep injustice, rapid expansion, and cultural clashes. The legends we hear today are just one side of the story. The real history is more complex, and often far more tragic. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Wild West was fading. The untamed frontier that had once symbolized opportunity, danger, and adventure was being transformed by industrialization, urbanization, and a growing federal presence. The very forces that had built the West, railroads, cattle ranching, and migration, were now taming it, leading to its inevitable decline. One of the most significant factors in the fall of the Wild West was industrialization. As railroads stretched across the continent, connecting remote territories with the major cities in the East, isolation disappeared. Towns that had once been small, self-sufficient outposts now became part of a larger economic system. Factories and industries grew, especially in urban centers like Chicago and San Francisco, drawing people away from frontier life and into wage labor. The romanticized life of the cowboy, the outlaw, and the pioneer was being replaced by factories, offices, and a structured workforce. With industrialization came urbanization. Cities in the West grew rapidly, offering modern conveniences, law enforcement, and stability. The days of lawless boomtowns were numbered as settlers preferred security over adventure. Once towns established banks, police forces, and functioning legal systems, there was little room left for vigilantes, shootouts, or outlaw gangs. As a result, many famous outlaws either died in gunfights, were arrested, or faded into obscurity. The cattle industry, which had defined much of the Wild West for decades, also began to decline. During the heyday of cattle drives in the 1860s and 1870s, millions of cattle were herded across open plains to railheads for transport to eastern markets. However, by the 1880s, barbed wire fences had begun to change the landscape. Invented in the 1870s, barbed wire allowed landowners to fence off huge sections of land, preventing open-range grazing. This led to fierce land disputes between cattle, barons, small ranchers, and settlers, sometimes erupting into violent conflicts like the Johnson County War in Wyoming. In addition to fencing, severe winters in 1886 and 1887 devastated cattle populations, killing hundreds of thousands of animals and bankrupting many ranchers. At the same time, railroads had expanded to the point that cattle no longer needed to be driven long distances, making the role of the cowboy increasingly obsolete. By the 1890s, large-scale corporate ranching replaced the independent cattle drives that had once defined cowboy culture. While industrialization and economic shifts transformed the West, one of the most tragic aspects of its fall was the final suppression of Native American resistance. Throughout the 19th century, tribes had fought to defend their lands from encroaching settlers and the U.S. military. By the 1880s, most major resistance had been crushed, with Native Americans being forced onto reservations. However, one final conflict, Wounded Knee in 1890, marked the symbolic end of Native American armed resistance. The ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival among many Plains tribes, spread fear among U.S. officials. The movement's followers believed that performing the ghost dance would bring back their ancestors, restore the buffalo, and drive white settlers away. In response, the U.S. government attempted to suppress the movement, leading to the arrest and killing of Sioux leader Sitting Bull in December 1890. Days later, U.S. soldiers confronted a group of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. A misunderstanding led to a gunshot, and the soldiers opened fire, massacring over 250 Lakota men, women, and children. The massacre at Wounded Knee was not just a military defeat. It was the symbolic end of Native American resistance in the West. The final nail in the coffin of the Wild West came in 1890 when the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared the frontier closed. For decades, the frontier had been seen as a place of opportunity and expansion, but by 1890, nearly all of the land had been settled. There was no longer an uncharted, untamed wilderness to explore. The age of pioneers, cowboys, and outlaws had come to an end. Though the Wild West faded, its legacy endured. The myths, legends, and stories of this era continued to shape American identity for generations. But by the end of the 19th century, the world of the Wild West was no longer a reality. It had become history. The Wild West may have ended as a historical period, but its influence on American identity remains stronger than ever. It shaped the country's perception of itself, fostering ideals of rugged individualism, perseverance, and the pursuit of opportunity. The frontier became a symbol of American exceptionalism, the belief that the nation was destined to expand and innovate. The idea of carving out a life in an untamed land, overcoming hardship, and forging one's own path remains central to the American ethos. One of the most lasting legacies of the Wild West is its mythology. While the reality was far more complex, the stories that emerged from this era became legendary. Figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, and Wild Bill Hickok were transformed into folk heroes and anti-heroes, their exploits exaggerated and dramatized. Outlaws were either glorified as rebellious figures fighting against corrupt institutions or vilified as ruthless criminals. Lawmen were depicted as noble enforcers of justice, despite the fact that many were just as brutal as the outlaws they pursued. This romanticized version of the West was cemented in popular culture through dime novels in the late 19th century, Wild West shows led by figures like Buffalo Bill, and later Hollywood Westerns. In the early 20th century, Western films became one of the most defining genres in American cinema, reinforcing the image of the cowboy as the ultimate American hero. Films like Stagecoach, 1939, The Searchers, 1956, and The Good, the Bad, and The Ugly, 1966, painted the West as a lawless but noble land where justice was delivered at the end of a gun barrel. Even as the classic Western gave way to more revisionist takes, such as Unforgiven, 1992, and Deadwood, 2004, the fascination with the Wild West never faded. Beyond pop culture, the physical traces of the Old West still remain. Ghost towns. dot the landscape, remnants of once booming mining settlements that were abandoned when the gold and silver ran out. Historic towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Deadwood, South Dakota, continue to attract visitors eager to step back in time. Rodeos and cowboy culture are still alive, particularly in states like Texas, Wyoming, and Montana, where cattle ranching traditions persist. The spirit of independence and self-reliance that defined the frontier era still influences rural communities and political attitudes in the American West today. Even modern technology and industry can be seen as an extension of the frontier mentality. Space exploration is often referred to as the new frontier, echoing the language used to describe the westward expansion of the 19th century. The tech boom in Silicon Valley has been likened to a gold rush, with entrepreneurs seeking fortune in uncharted territory. The Wild West may be long gone, but its legacy continues to shape America's vision of itself, proving that while the frontier may have closed, the pioneer spirit never truly died. The Wild West was a time of rapid expansion, opportunity, and conflict, a period that shaped America's identity in ways still felt today. From the lawless boomtowns and legendary outlaws to the rise of railroads and the eventual taming of the frontier, this era was as complex as it was transformative. While Hollywood has often romanticized it, the real Wild West was far more nuanced, filled with moments of heroism, brutality, innovation, and injustice. The myths of the West endure, but the reality is just as fascinating. The Wild West didn't disappear overnight. It evolved. Industrialization, barbed wire, and law enforcement gradually replaced the untamed frontier, while the stories of cowboys, Native American resistance, and legendary gunfights became part of American folklore. But now I want to hear from you. Was the Wild West really as wild as legend tells? Or has history exaggerated its lawlessness and adventure? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Stay tuned for our next episode where we explore another fascinating chapter of the past.